Hello, my name is Mia. I will be focusing on Module 6, which is titled Feminism, Intersectionality, and Agency Without Borders. The three readings for this lesson are as followed, and I will read them because I do not know them verbatim and I don't want to butcher anything. So we have Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory Practicing Solidarity by Chandra Mohanty, Women's Activism and Globalization by Nancy Naples and Manisha Desai, and Beyond Subordination versus Resistance, an Intersectional Approach to the Agency of Veiled Muslim Women by Sirma Bilaj. Given the titles, we can safely assume that this module probably has something to do with women. Now, one may be thinking, Mia, you must be an expert on all things feminism, being that you are a living, breathing female, and you're wearing the shirt, the signature, the Futures female shirt that everybody buys at Urban Outfitters. To which I would say, well, I'm so relieved you asked me that, because this brings me to the main theme, really, of the readings, which is this concept of transnational feminism solidarity. Now, being that I am a little bit of an artiste, I added some graphics. It's the best way I learn and how I teach, so I hope you don't mind. So, as best explained by Naples and Desai, a transnational approach negates the fact that just because you are a woman, you have the knowledge of every struggle of every woman around the world, and pushes us as humans, but females especially, to validate each other by recognizing the racial, cultural, socioeconomic, political, environmental, etc. issues that exist on already patriarchal grounds. Even in establishing these structured adjustment programs to benefit women, the Western framework of feminism often advertises exclusively to countries that exhibit those ideals. And so you have this disconnect between activist movements, which I believe, and as outlined in literally every reading so far, is perpetuated by capitalism. I would continue for the next several hours speaking about capitalism and patriarchy as the root of all evil, but instead I want to focus on women. So under the titles of gendered restructuring of labor and women's resistance and asserting the right to work, we see examples of women detailing the relationship of their informal work and unpaid household labor to the formal economy. Now, the authors argue there is evidence of increasing employment despite selective cases in women, and selective increase in women's labor, essentially saying that these women were and still are overworked while being undervalued. And we see examples of the pushback in the text, pointing out to the maquiladoras in Mexico, to the establishment of the international coalitions such as Women Working Worldwide in the UK, which highlights women from India to Peru to Korea to the Southeast Asia region. We see examples of pushing through barriers like the Self-Employed Women's Association or the SEWA in India, advocating and calling for visibility and unionizing. And even more examples from communities all over Africa. In a similar way, we see a revolutionary system happening within and across countries for solidarity activism, as illustrated later in the reading by the Nicaraguan women, as well as the women in Nicaragua, affected by poverty at the hands of militaristic government. Another aspect that ties into the labor force is something millions of Americans currently struggle with, which is, well, we struggle with a lot, but one of them being healthcare and employment benefits. So for women, especially in third world countries, I think the struggle for basic human rights is exacerbated by the inevitability of their work at home or their unpaid necessary childcare. The amazing way in which these women have responded to this problem is while creating community-based health projects and demanding their state be held accountable for creating these equitable health systems, they are developing an international network that exists to influence international change. An organization called CEHAT assumes that, quote, equitable and appropriate healthcare can be possible only in a context of economic and social equality, end quote. Diving ahead to other sectors, I was particularly interested in the worsening effects of climate change as seen in the third world perspective, and the authors give a quick outline of the damage caused from consumerism and war and global economics, and we see from the destruction of the rainforest to the desertification in Africa to here in our backyard, where the rapidly decreasing supply of fresh water is caused by the outpouring of toxic chemicals and materials continuously being recklessly thrown into our water, into our land. So now at this point, you must be wondering, surely there was a creation of a, convention of the elimination of all discrimination against women. You'd be correct. 1979, it was finally adopted and then not ratified by the US because they thought it was meaningless. So, nothing's changed. Speaking of meaningless, it would be futile to speak on the struggles existing in different communities of women without recognizing there's a duty to link them and make an active change, which is described very succinctly in Chandra Mohanty's Feminism Without Borders. And the name itself may ring a bell or two. So the name spins off the concept of Doctors Without Borders, as Mohanty believes there are similar goals at work in both. She does want to make the distinction that this does not mean borderless feminism, which implies that there are no differences or fault lines. She says that instead we must think expansively and be inclusive in our feminist ideals in order to transcend them. And this innately highlights white feminism and even first world feminism as problematic due to the socio-historical or socioeconomic othering that happens when minority communities are addressed. So, a major gap caused by capitalism, shocking, is a huge proponent of classism, which exists to separate feminism into these little boxes. The author says that this type of feminism focuses on, quote, financial equality between men and women and is grounded in the capitalist values of profit, competition, and accumulation, and as symptomatic of the Americanization definitions of feminism, end quote. And Mohanty doesn't stop there with adding the nail in the coffin that is the imminent demise caused by capitalism. She further explains that in order to decolonize feminism, we have to reorient our actions, such as demystifying the very thing that we all take a part of. You guessed it. Anyways, a way to do that is the pedagogical approach, which essentially means that, if you're in this class, you probably are aware that the world is both literally and figuratively burning. And so higher education should be a space of reprieve to discuss these things. But paradoxically, the universe has its own racially charged undertones of affirmative action, nepotism, sexism, to which radical educators are the only saving grace. Also, Mohanty does speak of her own experiences as an Indian woman, highlighting her feelings of always belonging to the title of foreigner in a first-class world. And I myself, being born of an immigrant parent, I've dealt with issues of othering taking forms of like backhanded compliments where exotic means not like us. So the important takeaway from Mohanty's work is her desire and demand for a unified, solidarity across borders among women for feminism to truly reach and surpass its goals. And ultimately, women want to be equal in the grand scheme of things: equal paying jobs, equal healthcare and reproductive rights, equal education, and so on and so forth. So it's crucial that women also see each other as equal when engaged in feminist discourse. And I think taking a look at the Veiled Woman article, we receive a perspective that raises the question of agency and what it means to have it. And again, picking apart the Western or liberal views of feminist movements, we see that there is a huge disconnect when it comes to certain aspect of a woman's agency. Specifically relating to religious practices, we see the piety of a Muslim woman and her dedication to her religious beliefs challenged as a dichotomy of oppression versus resistance. And I think it's interesting to note that in Catholicism, nuns are usually not seen as devoid of their agency, yet the veil symbolizes an almost complete disregard for Western beauty standards and defiance against normative female liberation. And I think this is perpetuated by scholars and experts that shun these quote-unquote poor victims of oppression, and yet even these women, if they were in fact acting as radicals against the male gaze and colonialism, this is still not good enough, because a woman must only have agency if she fits the prescription. So I think ultimately it's worth mentioning that we have to get rid of cherry-picking feminism and activism in general. I think that in order to be a feminist, one must also be anti-racist and anti-homophobic and anti-ableist and, so on, until one can encompass the idea that a woman's liberation is her own and that we can guide her and champion these efforts, but that we do not force them. In conclusion, to wrap up my rambling, feminism is not a white utopia. Western ideals or feminist movements must be reconstructed to be more inclusive, and we must all strive for a collective solidarity. And if we do this correctly, the patriarchy will be dismantled along the way. Thank you for listening.